Hello, good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well and you're seeing this. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to allow everybody to get in and we will start. All right, I think we're going to make a start. So, good morning, and not sure if good afternoon and maybe good evening for someone out there. And welcome to everyone to this fantastic session about climate resilient sanitation. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Íñigo Ruiz Apilanez. I'm an associate director in Arup, and today I'm very honored to be virtually gathered by some of the best experts in climate resilient adaptation from the public and the private sector, but also from the academia and some multilaterals. Just to give you a brief summary of what we have ahead, the session will start with an enlightening introduction to what we mean by climate resilient sanitation by Dr. Leoni. This will be followed by two thematic deep dives around the enabling environment for CRS, led by Sam and Eric. Then Nancy and Paula will share with us two exemplary case studies with a touch on highlights from Nairobi and San Francisco. Following this, we will host a short panel discussion, and last but not least, Diego from the World Bank will close with some remarks and positive steps towards pathways for climate resilient sanitation. During the course of the session, we will be operating a Mentimeter. I hope that everyone is familiar with that. It's an interactive platform where we encourage you to ask questions, and we will then raise these questions during our passion session, during our panel session towards the end. Please look at the QR code on the slides. You have it up there, or you can enter just the number in your phone. Okay, so with that, let's start setting the scene with Leoni. Leoni is a consultant for water supply and sanitation with over 12 years of experience and has recently completed a PhD with the University of Leeds with a focus on financing and equity aspects of urban water supply and sanitation. Leoni, welcome.
Hello, everybody. I was asked to set the scene for this session. And since at least here in Stockholm, it's Monday morning, 8 a.m., I thought we should start with the very basics. Next slide, please. What is climate resilient and why is resilient sanitation and why is it important? Well, as so often it turns out that the basics aren't that basic because we actually don't have the one definitive definition of climate resilient sanitation. But various organizations, agencies, and researchers are currently shaping such a definition. And here I want to highlight the efforts of the Climate Resilient Sanitation Coalition, as well as the work led by the JMP on actually defining indicators to measure climate resilient sanitation. For now, I think we can say that there is progressively a consensus that climate resilient sanitation includes an integrated consideration of adaptation, meaning reducing the impacts of climate change on sanitation service delivery, and mitigation, reducing the contributions of sanitation to climate change. So why is it important? I will cite the very first sentence of the 2022 landscape study on urban sanitation and climate change by the Institute of Sustainable Future. They open with, climate change is the new operating context for delivering urban sanitation services rather than a distant imperative. And because we don't only live in the age of climate change, but also in the age of AI, I've also asked the computers why they think it is important. And this picture is actually AI generated. So the computers get it. So we cannot let them overtake us quite yet. So we simply have no choice but to make our sanitation systems more resilient to climate change. And this applies both to high income and low income countries. And later in the session, we will hear case studies from Nairobi, Kenya and San Francisco in the US, showing what municipalities and service providers are already doing in this space. Next slide, please. And these case studies, along with what many of the speakers will point to today, will demonstrate that our current sanitation systems are far from perfect. And many cities are already facing immense pressures on their sanitation systems due to demographic changes and urban planning challenges. And these pressures are then compounded by the impacts of climate change. And we know quite a bit about how sanitation systems fail. And then we can link these failures to climate effects and hazards along the entire sanitation chain. And we can then see that many impacts of climate change on urban sanitation systems will increase the occurrence of sanitation failures. So, for instance, that means combined sewer overflows during extreme rainfall. That means sewer blockages due to reduced water flows, failure of septic tanks due to rising sea levels, and the overflowing or destruction of latrines during floods and storms. And these failures have serious implications for people, because, for example, the WHO has linked the current surge in cholera, not solely, but in part to the effects of climate change. There are also implications for the environment, for our planet. Greenhouse gas emissions from sanitation systems contribute to global warming, and failing sanitation systems pollute freshwater and marine ecosystems. And then finally, these failures also impact prosperity and the economy. They cause damage to infrastructure, they cause income and educational losses, increase of household and public spending on health, and much more. Next slide, please. So how can it be fixed? Again, there is no easy answer, but the speakers will explore some possible pathways forward. Technical solutions, including gray and green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, are important. But crucially, we need reflective and proactive management of sanitation system that goes way beyond reacting to a crisis. And we need to make sure that these efforts also include circular economy approaches. And finally, we need frameworks that enable resilience in terms of policy, institutions, regulations, and finance. And Sam will give some reflections on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonie. Thank you very much for setting the scene so clearly. Then let's move then to our first deep dive that is going to be in charge of Sam Drabble. Sam is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor. While at WSUP, Sam has rolled out research into policy initiatives across the six country programs in Africa and Asia that WSUP runs, and author or editor over 60 technical publications. Over the past 3 years, Sams had led global research studies on sanitation systems strengthening for the World Bank, WHO, ESAWAS, and UN Habitat, amongst others. Prior to joining WSUP, Sam worked as an analyst in the evaluation and performance management team at RAND Europe, and this built on experience with learning and development team at the UK Institute for Government. Welcome, Sam. Please move into the first deep dive session.
Great. Thank you, Inigo. So I'm going to give a rapid overview of key recommendations emerging from a study delivered by WSUP and Arup for World Bank on climate resilient urban sanitation. I just want to say that I'm going to cover a lot of ground quite quickly, but we feel it's important to give a sense of the breadth of PIRF measures that are needed to enable climate resilient sanitation, and also bearing in mind that this area, PIRF and enabling climate resilient sanitation, is relatively under-researched within this topic to date. So recommendation 1, and this is based on consultation with sector experts and literature review: policy, institutional and regulatory frameworks need to support the integration of sanitation with wider urban services and development processes. So we know that climate resilient sanitation involves interdependencies between water supply, sanitation, sewer and on-site stormwater management, solid waste management, and other basic services. From a PIRF perspective, that means that policy and institutional frameworks need to support integration and, at a minimum, integration of water supply, sewers, and on-site sanitation that supports stability of financial flows as well as other positive impacts. It's also noted that ministries of finance, and specifically climate finance units where these exist, must be engaged to support this level of coordination, as well as cross-ministry working groups to drive forward cross-sectoral dialogue. And the image you see on the right-hand side here is conditions in Mukuru, which is a low-income area in Nairobi in Kenya, where there is now an integrated slum upgrading program that has taken place involving simplified sewers, a really great example of a climate resilient sanitation solution as part of a wider slum upgrading process. Next. Recommendation 2, policy frameworks should promote circular economy approaches. So to unlock the full potential of climate resilient sanitation, linkages need to be emphasized between wastewater and fecal sludge reuse, safe wastewater and fecal sludge reuse, and wider climate resilience, particularly in water scarce contexts. So we know that the reuse of treated wastewater, for example, can play a really important role in reducing water shortages, and that needs to be highlighted. There are also a range of specific policy level changes that are required to enable circular economy approaches, including, for example, explicit recognition of container-based sanitation. That's lacking still in a majority of countries, and demonstration projects of those approaches to achieve proof of concept will also be required. Next. Following from that emphasis on the circular economy, there's a need to upskill service providers and ensure that they are prepared for a future of multiple revenue streams so that they're able to capitalize on, for example, sales of byproducts in sanitation, but more broadly to equip service providers with climate-specific knowledge and skills. And we highlight the roles of relevant line ministries, taking the lead in driving what's required here, which are comprehensive capacity building programs to retool the sanitation sector at all levels. All staff within service authorities need to understand the implications of climate change for the menu of service options within citywide inclusive sanitation. And there are mechanisms that can support that, such as peer-to-peer learning networks, partnerships between service authorities and research institutions. Next. Recommendation 4 is on regulation. Climate resilience needs to be mainstreamed into regulations, guidelines, standards, codes of practice at every step of the sanitation service chain. There are some detailed recommendations in this area, what this practically involves. So, for example, on-site sanitation systems, there needs to be the development of minimum standards for infrastructural improvements at the containment stage. Frameworks need to support continued transportation of fecal sludge, protect serviceability of network systems. Importantly, and Leonie mentioned active management, frameworks need to enable the progressive formalization of pit and tank emptying services to support that, particularly in low-income countries. There are also regulators such as URSA, it's worth mentioning, that are reviewing and revising frameworks to address some of those challenges around integrated urban water resilience, such as stormwater management. And per policy, it's worth highlighting that there are a number of countries across regions that are reviewing policy and regulatory frameworks for sanitation right now. And that provides a window of opportunity to support those countries in mainstreaming climate resilient sanitation considerations. Next. Recommendation 5 here, I want to call out, we have Juliet Willits on the call in the panel later. So University of Technology Sydney have done fantastic research in this area, highlighting the importance of flexibility in climate resilient sanitation. So recommendation 5 is around the need for flexible planning, financing and regulatory frameworks to support service providers in adapting to emerging or unexpected conditions. This also involves using tools to support climate risk screening, adapting those tools to the specific needs of the urban sanitation sector, and critically, regulatory authorities need to allow service providers the discretion to innovate. And we reference the work of SOAS and within that NOASCO in Zambia in developing tools to support utilities in this area. Next. Recommendation 6 is relatively under-researched to date, and this references the importance of understanding the true costs of climate resilient sanitation. And from that, adapting tariff models to balance financial viability for the service provider with affordability for low-income consumers. So that process of adapting tariff models must begin with detailed context-specific analysis of the true costs of climate resilient sanitation, but that's lacking still in the majority of contexts. There's also a need to safeguard continuity of services, to monitor service tariffs and regulate during periods of high demand. There are some countries that are addressing this challenge around tariff structures, and we reference Chile and the work of SIS, the economic regulator there, as particularly relevant. Next. Moving into financing now, and we'll hear a case study from San Francisco shortly where green bonds are being utilized in this area. So we highlight that there are a range of green funding mechanisms that need to be leveraged to support climate resilient sanitation. That includes building momentum and credibility in the green bond market, but it also includes, of course, domestic resource mobilization. Can't emphasize enough that will be central to supporting climate resilient sanitation, and that will be supported by wide-ranging mechanisms such as policy-based loans, concessional financing, PPPs, microfinance, microinsurance, and so forth. Next. Coming back to this point around the circular economy, but also stimulating private sector engagement more broadly, there's a need for targeted financial incentives to support private sector engagement and resource recovery. So there are a menu of financial incentives we set out. Those include results-based financing, targeted subsidies to support private sector provision of formalized pit emptying services, coming back to that principle of active management, as well as other mechanisms such as tax-based incentive, economic policy incentives, emission trading schemes. Next. And finally, bringing this together and looking at a higher level, we emphasize, of course, the importance of including sanitation and climate change in adaptation action and doing that in a consistent way from international to city level. So including sanitation and climate action begins with inclusion in nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans. Together, those can ensure a top-down driver for the development of climate resilient sanitation programs. And there needs to be consistency of national and local legislation and support in developing local and city action plans in this area. Okay, I'll close there. So I haven't been able to highlight really the many case studies that exist, but I hope you've had a sense from the slides that there are examples in each of these areas which countries can learn from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. This has been great and I think incredibly well condensed. Let's move actually now to our second deep dive that it's going to be led by Eric. Eric is the acting country director of the international NGO IDE in Madagascar. Since January of this year, IDE has been implementing an ambitious urban sanitation project funded by USAID and targeting 3 of the major large cities in Madagascar. Eric has more than 15 years of experience in operational management of World Bank development programs, and before he spent more than 10 years in the private sector, particularly focusing in the field of market research. Hi, Eric. I'll give it to you now.
Thank you, Nigo. Greetings from Madagascar. It's a privilege to represent IDE, which recently celebrated 40 years of fighting for shared prosperity in such key sectors as climate smart agriculture, nutrition, and inclusive sanitation. Through our market-based and human-centered design approach, IDE has been able over the last 12 years to facilitate the sales of improved or safely managed toilets to almost 9 million people in countries as diverse as Cambodia, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Ghana, Nepal, or Vietnam. Next, please. Our primary aim is to improve people's quality of life by increasing WASH adoption and behavior change. And this, we believe, can be best accomplished through the market. IDE's 4 pillars are: start with people, design to context, business delivers by mobilizing the private sector and empowering entrepreneurs to deliver appropriate solutions, and use real-time data to measure performance and adapt our approach. Next, please. What we have constantly observed is that people are most likely to invest in solutions that comes from their own ideas and desires. Using HCD, human-centered design, we make no assumption about what people want. Instead, we develop a deep understanding of people's lives to inspire designs and market-based ideas. Then, we tailor technology designs that fit within the context of each particular village, city, or country. Next, please. Building on in-depth interviews, focus groups, observation, co-creation, early testing, the HCD approach aims to design, then scale up sales of products that are desirable, meaning that the solutions need to be valuable and attractive to the end users. The solutions must be adapted to the social and cultural environment. We also have to propose feasible solutions which are applicable to the geographic and physical context, and in addition meet basic requirements related to standards and functionality. Also, whenever possible, materials and components have to be easily available and preferably locally. Solutions need also to be viable, which implies that they are affordable and aligned with the household's willingness and ability to pay. And they should be environmentally friendly and climate resilient. Next, please. Since January of this year, IDE has started the implementation of the urban sanitation project in Madagascar. The challenges are huge when you know that 40% of the Malagasy people live in urban areas. 1 in 6 people still practices open defecation, or 1/3 of the urban population use non-improved toilets. Next, please. These pictures tells you a lot about the household's daily life conditions in our target cities. These are not isolated cases. These are not cases on the outskirts of cities either, but in the very center, behind the main avenues, behind the beautiful buildings. This is a vital health issue. This is a human dignity issue, but this is also a living together issue. Next, please. So our theory of change is based on 2 pillars. The first one is building resilient and inclusive market system. We strive to stimulate the demand by fostering behavioral change. Secondly, on the supply side, we support enterprises to provide desirable, affordable, and climate resilient services and products. But the second pillar is also very important, which is to create a conducive environment. This implies innovative financing, appropriate regulatory frameworks, and most and foremost, stronger coordination and planification by local authorities. Next, please. So climate resilience is a critical issue in this project, knowing that Madagascar is one of the African countries most severely affected by climate change impacts, and Madagascar experiences an average of 3 cyclones per year. Next, please. We are still very early in the implementation phase of this project, but these are 2 pictures resulting from the HZT research that provide examples of basic designs that fit with the end user's aspirational products and also their willingness to pay. But at the same time, these designs embed technical solutions that address the impacts of strong winds and flooding provoked by cyclones and an increasingly high water table. Last slide, please. I would like to conclude this presentation with a quote of IDE's founder, Paul Pollack, a great visionary, who 40 years ago stated that the most direct and effective way to end poverty is to create new inclusive markets in order to allow people living in poverty to be the main actors. Thank you.
No, thank you, Eric. Thank you so much, and also Sam for these 2 very enlightening nudges, deep dives that you've done. Let's move now to see how the theory is actually put in practice even more, even though Eric already has started with that. And let's start with the first of the case studies that we're having today. The first one is coming from Nairobi, and that will be presented from Nancy Ngao. Nancy has a strong background in working in innovative and creative spaces, solving complex social problems. At Fresh Life, she works in government affairs, leading the strategic management and direction of the organization in government partnerships, policy, and advocacy. Her work involves representing the organization in the formulation and amendment of legal, policy, and regulatory frameworks to strengthen the enabling environment for Fresh Life to scale while building and maintaining a strategic relationship with various decision makers at Kenya's national and country government levels to advance the organization's mission and goals. Nancy also supports private-public stakeholder knowledge sharing and capacity building to advance partnership with the sector peers. Nancy, how are you? Please, if you can start with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. So as mentioned, I'm representing Fresh Life. We work in the circular approach for sanitation in the underserved areas. Those are urban informal settlements, providing clean and safe sanitation options. And I'll just go right into speaking about our experience in Nairobi, especially partnering with government. So I want to come into climate challenges in Nairobi. So unlike the first presentation, these are not AI-generated images. These are real images from flooding crisis that we experienced this year in Nairobi, actually in the whole country in Kenya, but these images are from Nairobi. So one of the main challenges when it comes to climate and sanitation is when we have increased rainfall and poor drainage systems, these can lead to damaging of infrastructure and overwhelming sanitation systems. And this is especially when these sanitation systems are not well maintained. So it leads to not only loss of lives, which is something that we experience, but substantial damage to sanitation infrastructure. Another challenge in Nairobi is drought and water scarcity. So urban areas like Nairobi are really struggling with water supply due to the over-extraction of groundwater, contamination of water sources, and increased demand from a growing population. And the areas that have availability of water, as I've mentioned, still run the risk of consuming contaminated water due to unsafely managed waste. And this is especially in informal settlements. Another challenge is urbanization and informal settlements. We've seen a rapid urban growth and proliferation of informal settlements, which is posing a challenge to providing adequate sanitation services. Informal settlements populations are estimated to triple to 3 billion globally by 2050. In Nairobi alone, we have 60% of people living in informal settlements where they do not have access to clean and safe sanitation, and the population keeps growing and urbanization cannot catch up. All these services in government cannot catch up to the growth. You can go to the next slide. Just highlighting the situation in urban informal settlements, again, not AI-generated images, where we only look at access, not really looking at where does the waste go. And in Nairobi, we have over 60% of the waste being unsafely managed. It's either dumped in the environment or in water bodies like rivers. You can see the top left image, that's actually a river in Nairobi that has been damaged because of improperly managed sanitation waste. You can go to the next slide. To solve these challenges, we need key actors to come together, and it's very important for me to highlight that this coordination needs to be government-led. So the government is mandated to implement sanitation services, and so the government must lead for there to be sustainability and longevity in some of these solutions. The government must be at the forefront. So of course we have the different roles of government, but most importantly is to develop policies to support sanitation development. And I must highlight that not just to develop policies, but to take it a step further and operationalize these policies. So for example, in Kenya, we have very rich policies, but what's lacking is just the next step to ensure that they're operationalized. But we've seen a lot of policy development that's linked to climate resilient sanitation. We have our first national sanitation management policy that is currently in Parliament and will be the first in Africa, domesticated from the Africa Minister Council of Water, Africa Sanitation Policy Guidelines. We also have our Climate Change Act. It's now being amended to provide for carbon markets. And we have developed a strategy, the long-term low emission development strategy 2050, that's outlining Kenya's long-term approach to achieving low carbon and climate resilient development. So there's a lot of movement in policy in Kenya for that. Private sector, of course, holds the innovation. But like I said in the beginning, government are the mandate holders, and for private sector, we're here to complement the efforts of government to provide the sanitation services. For development partners, of course, we have the funding, mobilization of partners, and most importantly, capacity building efforts. For the community, which are a huge component, a huge stakeholder for pushing forward the conversation on sanitation. If we're able to foster strong community involvement from the start, from planning to implementation, and not just handing them the solution, because communities do play a very big role in identifying what they need, also ensuring cultural appropriateness, especially when we're talking about new innovations for sanitation, and we're able to now maintain that sustainability and resilience and have these local communities empowered to even manage and maintain sanitation infrastructure. The next slide. So some of the approaches to resilient sanitation, we need to focus on what we can do now and with the situation, the current situation. When you look at informal settlements, three aspects: there's no space, there's no time, and we don't have enough money to connect people to conventional sanitation systems like the conventional sewers. So we need solutions that are flexible, that are low cost, and can fit into the informal settlements context. So we need holistic approaches combining sanitation improvements with broader urban development efforts like housing, water supply, and infrastructure upgrades. You cannot leave sanitation behind. You can't talk about education without sanitation, climate without sanitation, women and health without sanitation. So other solutions that are possible to get us there are container-based sanitation, which are dry toilets. They do not need water, so we're saving a lot of water. Waste is also segregated at the source. We have simplified sewers, they're cost-effective infrastructure that does not need as much funding and maintenance like the conventional sewers. I've talked about integrating slum integration of sanitation options for slum upgrading. We also have how can these approaches be supported even more through policy and regulation. Of course, creating an enabling environment for innovative solutions like container-based sanitation, and financing, leveraging both public, private, and donor funding to scale up resilient sanitation models. In Kenya, we have a funding gap of 3.4 billion USD, and this is just for urban areas, urban sanitation. So there's a huge gap, and we need to leverage financing from all parties involved. And for policy, we've seen a lot of movement, like I've mentioned before, that is allowing innovative solutions like container-based sanitation to thrive. We've seen national goals in Kenya changing from 80% sewered, 20% non-sewered, to now 60% non-sewered, 40% sewered, to enable the country to reach its 2030 sanitation goals. Last slide. This is just a call to action as the outro for this presentation. So, of course, collaboration, encouraging stakeholders to work together to enhance sanitation infrastructure and services. And, of course, as I said, government-led, but for private sector to not work in silos. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are quite a couple of proven sanitation options or innovations that are working. We just need to scale. innovation, supporting and scaling up innovative approaches. We've talked about container-based sanitation, simplified sewers. How can we have an enabling environment for these to work? And mobilizing community support. Let the local community be at the forefront and have them participate from the start for better adaptation and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And very good luck with all those projects. It seems incredibly relevant. Our second case comes from San Francisco. However, because of the time difference, Paula has pre-recorded her presentation. Paula Kehoe is the Director of Water Resources with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and she's responsible for diversifying San Francisco water supply portfolio through the implementation of water conservation, groundwater, recycled water, on-site water reuse, and innovation programs. Paula organized San Francisco's landmark legislation, allowing for the collection, decentralized treatment, and reuse of alternate water resources within building and district. Paula also leads the One Water SF program, which has cultivated a shift to an integrated approach to water, wastewater, and power management. And apart from this, Paula is also the chair of the National Blue Ribbon Commission for On-Site Water System and is a board member of the Water Reuse Association. I think we can play now the case study that Paula has recorded. Thanks. I think we're having some. Okay, let's see if maybe we can fix that or put it. Okay, maybe we can try to see if we can play it in other system or something. And in the meantime, we can maybe move to the panel discussion or start with that. And we can come back to that video after. Okay, so then let's move to the panel session, and we can recover later the video of the San Francisco case study. For this panel session, apart from Eric, Nancy, and Sam, is going to join us Juliet Willets. Professor Juliet Willets is a research director at the University of Technology Sydney's Institute of Sustainable Future. She leads applied research to inform water and sanitation policy and practice in Asia and the Pacific. Her contributions cover climate change, gender equality, and public health aspects, partnering with governments, international agencies, and civil society organizations. She has received multiple awards, including the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence and International Water Association's Gender Diversity and Water Award in 2024. And she holds a PhD from the University of New South Wales in environmental engineering and is widely published with more than 150 peer-reviewed articles. Welcome, Juliet. And let's start with you. We were discussing now when we talk about like transformative adaptation and connecting sanitation to the wider context. How do you think like climate resilient sanitation is being considered within these wider adaptation programs in urban areas?
Great, thank you, and thanks for the chance to contribute today. So in terms of transformative adaptation and what that might mean for climate resilient sanitation, I think first of all, we need to clarify how is it different to just incremental change or making incremental improvements to address climate change issues, such as we've heard about droughts, about floods, and the kinds of impacts that those have on sanitation services. And the key thing is that we need more transformative change in the case that we're really hitting hard limits. So when water scarcity becomes a driver for sanitation rather than business as usual, or because we're reaching limits to the nutrient cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, and we need to think about how we recycle them better into agriculture. So when you're hitting hard limits, it means that you've got an opportunity to configure systems differently and to work across different systems, not just urban sanitation, but how it interlinks with, as Nancy mentioned, with urban housing, how it interlinks with nearby peri-urban agriculture. And so to make kind of transformative change means that we need to step back from the ways that things are already being done and question some of the assumptions. And I think there's another example that was described in Arup and WSUP and the World Bank's research, which is Chennai. And Chennai is an interesting, I guess, case study of where the whole urban water cycle has been quite reconfigured. It's been reconfigured because there's a need for water. There's water scarcity limits that are being hit. And so that has provided a driver to do much higher levels of wastewater reuse than we've seen elsewhere. And it's enabled by policy change at the national level, at the state level, at the city level. And it means that the different stakeholder groups have been brought together, including industry, to look at that urban water cycle and to implement, I guess, changes to household sanitation such that we can enable greater industrial water reuse and also non-potable reuse. So for me, transformative adaptation is about those bigger changes in how sanitation sits in the wider water cycle. And it's also about addressing power structures. And so we heard Nancy's example of informal settlements. We know that informal settlements and lower socioeconomic groups are the worst hit. They have lower quality sanitation to begin with, that performs even worse when you add floods or droughts. And so transformative adaptation means that we need to place those at the forefront of policies and the way that regulations are set up so that we can enable service provision to those groups first and improve those first rather than leaving them to be addressed later on. So I hope that gives a few ideas about working across different scales, sectors, and to address power structures towards better transformation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Juliet. Sam, let's move to you now. Like during your presentation, you were constantly referring to the policy, institution, regulation, and finance, the PIRF. Could you please share with us how do you think all these four areas fit together? And what is the connectivity and sequencing of PIRF in relation to climate resilient sanitation?
Yeah, thank you, Inigo. So it's a great question. We've set out a number of recommendations, but it's obviously very important to understand how those mechanisms interrelate, how actions in one area of that PIRF framework can impact elsewhere. And actually, as part of the study that we've been referencing, we also conducted a causal loop analysis to identify leverage points, help to inform the sequencing of potential PIRF interventions. And there are three key points I'd draw out from that. First of all, regulators can act as a critical pivot between policy and institutions. So we've seen that regulators can have a significant influence both on the substance of policies that promote climate resilient sanitation, but they're also key to translating climate resilient policies for institutions. So that's particularly the case where there are independent regulatory authorities responsible for regulating sanitation. And so that implies that to strengthen climate resilient sanitation, regulatory capacity is likely to be a key lever. The second aspect is that changes in policy will be required to mandate integrated approaches that we've discussed, and that's at two levels, both within the sanitation sector, through, for example, integration of water and sanitation at the level of service providers and regulation, but also to support integration of sanitation with wider urban development. And the third insight is really on the specific function of financing, including domestic resource mobilization and external finance, and that's required to strengthen the capacity of institutions, among other measures, to ensure that those institutions are positioned to absorb and enact those policy changes. And finally, just to underline that incentives for institutional action created through domestic and external financing need to be aligned. There's more to say, but that's just three insights to share on that.
Thank you very much, Sam. Eric, I really love how you put people really, or the individual experience at the heart of sanitation, and how that needs to be like the main core of the solution. Following on this, what kind of perceptions do you think are being experienced at the moment in the field regarding climate resilient sanitation?
Thank you, Inigo. I will separate my response in two. First, on the authorities side, a huge amount of advocacy is still needed to foster the integration of climate resilient sanitation into local policies, into regulations, or even into urban planning. This is not surprising in a low-income country where social, economic, and infrastructure priorities are so numerous. But one positive thing is that the government is increasingly taking stock of the impact of climate change on sectors like nutrition or agriculture, especially in drought-affected regions. So there's hope that this awareness will progressively spread to sanitation policies. Another good trend is that the donors are now systematically incorporating climate change into the design of their finance project. And last, it must be recognized that international events, such as today's events, play a tremendous role in raising awareness. From a household perspective now, what we observe on the field is that even if households perceive and experience the impact of climate change in their daily life, and in sanitation in particular, the main obstacle is their willingness and ability to pay. In a country where the rate of open defecation is still very high, where it is more attractive to purchase a mobile phone or a cable TV subscription instead of a climate resilient sanitation service. But it is where HCD and the social behavioral change approach is so powerful. To give an example, our door-to-door sales techniques help in a very subtle way to make customers aware of the cost and of the hidden expenses of having non-climate resilient toilets and weak sanitation practices. So these are kind of the two sides of the perception of the CRS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. And finally, Nancy, based on your experience working with city governments, you were constantly saying that these need to be led by them, and I completely agree. What do you think are at the moment in their hand their priorities in relation to climate resilient sanitation? What is your experience by working with them so closely?
Okay. So first is facilitating policy alignment. And I've talked about policy a lot, but it is really the backbone of everything. So we have a huge challenge with inconsistent and unclear regulations, which are hindering the growth of sanitation projects. If government is able to streamline these regulations to ensure that organizations like Fresh Life are not facing any ambiguous or conflicting guidelines while implementing climate-friendly sanitation solutions, this could really propel us further. The public sector needs to streamline these regulations and policies and align these to sustainable development goals. And an example of this could be, for instance, creating tax incentives for eco-friendly sanitation technologies. Another one is fostering collaboration. This is just the coordination between various sectors, which is not where it needs to be, which is it has led to inefficient resource utilization. We've seen a huge step in the country. We now have urban sanitation national technical working groups where the Ministry of Water and the Ministry of Health are now leading that coordination effort, encouraging this collaboration, which is ensuring all key stakeholders are working together seamlessly and pooling resources for more impactful projects. And we've seen also development partners encouraging this coordinated effort and hosting, joint workshops, forums for knowledge sharing, which is really fostering collaboration. Another one is financial support mechanisms. The challenge here is we have limited financial resources for government and, of course, for organizations that are supporting the work that government is doing to invest in sustainable sanitation practices. How can the government establish dedicated funds or financial mechanisms to support sanitation projects? This can involve innovative financing mechanisms like results-based financing, sanitation surcharges or development fees that are ring-fenced to support sustainable sanitation solutions. We've seen movement in Kenya for that. We are now working on our sanitation development fee that we hope will be ring-fenced for, that is the plan for it to be ring-fenced for proper sanitation services. And the last thing that I would say is capacity building programs. And this is especially for climate financing. We have insufficient knowledge from both public and private sectors, and we have to seek out costly or expensive consultants from more developed countries. How can development partners that are working in countries like Kenya and developing countries invest in capacity building programs for both the public and the private sector? So this can look like training government officials on climate financing mechanisms and assisting organizations to develop climate resilient, robust project proposals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to give a try to see if we can play the video again before we try to answer some questions. Let me see if this works.
Kehoe. I'm the Director of Water Resources at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. The San Francisco PUC is a municipal public agency. We provide 3 utility services: water, power, and sanitation. Within our water utility, we serve 2.7 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area. Within our power enterprise, we produce both hydropower as well as solar power. And within our sanitation utility, we operate a combined sewer system in San Francisco where we collect and treat both stormwater and wastewater in the same set of pipes, treat the water, and discharge it to the San Francisco Bay and Pacific Ocean. The San Francisco PUC has been providing reliable service for over 100 years, and we want to continue to provide reliable service into the future. However, we face many challenges. For example, we're starting to see more common and more frequent and more severe droughts in California. We're also seeing more examples of extreme flooding. We have aging infrastructure, as well as the need to maintain high-quality drinking water, as well as high-quality water that's discharged to the San Francisco Bay and Pacific Ocean. Recognizing that the utility of the 21st century can't always operate like the utility of the 20th century. With that, we have changed our mindset. Instead of looking at our infrastructure from a linear perspective, we are now looking at it through a one water or circular economy lens. Having a one water approach looks at the ability to integrate planning across our various enterprises and utilities. This work enables us to create better integrated projects that have many more benefits than a singular benefits. We also recognize that we have the opportunity to look at our resources across the board. Things that we used to think of as wastewater or stormwater as actual waste are actually sources of water. So with all of this change in thinking, we are able to be more creative in how we do our programming and how we do our projects at the utility. For example, we looking at water in our water enterprise, we look at conserving and using water as efficiently as possible, as well as recycling water, taking water, whether it's from our centralized wastewater treatment plants and recycling that water for purposes to irrigate our large parks and golf courses in San Francisco, as well as looking at recycling water on a decentralized building scale, where many types of water sources are produced on a building scale that can be collected, treated, and safely reused for non-potable applications. Within our wastewater and sanitation enterprise, when we think about maintaining reliable sanitation service in the future, we've established a number of service goals. And those service goals look at how we can continue to provide service during and adapting to climate change. So we look at our assets that we currently have in place, as well as future assets, and look at the potential impacts that additional flooding as well as sea level rise may have on those assets. We also are looking at how we can potentially finance as well as create more green buildings with our capital improvement programs. We've opted to utilize green bonds as a way of financing major capital sewer projects that has less of an impact for our ratepayers. But by obtaining green bonds, those bonds are placed on projects that address capital projects that are looking at climate change and sustainability in the future. We're also looking at our community, and we look at all the work that we do through an equity lens. We want to make sure that our community, all of our community, is involved in how we design our buildings and our capital projects, as well as understand the potential impacts. And affordability is one of our biggest concerns, and we are working very, very hard to ensure that all of our customers have access to our services in an affordable manner. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity just to touch on a few of the initiatives at the San Francisco PUC, and I wish you a successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Paula Quijo from San Francisco. I'm just conscious of time, and I want to give Diego some time for our final remarks. So Diego, for maybe those few that you don't know him, Diego Rodriguez is the lead water economist from Eastern and Southern Africa. He's based in Pretoria, and his main focus is on climate change, resilience, and urban water security. Previously, he was a senior water resources management specialist in Mexico City, overseeing leading operations and sectorial studies. Globally, Diego leads the Water in the Circular Economy and Resilience Initiative and a team applying the Decision Tree framework to water resource planning and investment projects, considering resilience and uncertainties. Before the World Bank, Diego worked in the Inter-American Development Bank and the Danish Hydraulic Institute. Diego has a PhD in economics with a focus on water, and he has over 30 years of experience in economic projects analysis, no market valuations, hydroeconomic analysis, and integrating water into macroeconomic framework. Diego, so nice to have you here for those final session reflections, and please close.
Thank you, Inigo, and to everyone. I'm cognizant of time, so I'm gonna try and concentrate on sort of conveying 5 key messages that I think are to be highlighted from the session. I think the first one, and we just saw the San Francisco case, is that increasing water scarcity in our cities is forcing us to rethink our approaches to sanitation and to mainstream resilience. The second message would be also that the climate resilient sanitation systems generate an array of co-benefits, being environmental or climate change and others, and we need to properly capture this in our programs and our investments and how we design and plan our investments in the sector. Very critical, I think, is the importance of working with service providers to build their capacity and knowledge to include resilient sanitation in their plans and in their investments, and enabling. And we need to build the capacities also to enable them to capture the different revenue streams, as we heard in some of the presentations. Critical, and it was repeated over and over again, working on the different dimensions of policy, institutions, regulations, and financing. And I would like to stress here the importance also of that we need to be very aware of the potential limitations and opportunities in other sectors and policies, institutions, and regulations. Some of the limiting factors could be, for example, in energy or health regulatory frameworks, and we need to work with those sectors very closely. And finally, I would like to stress the fact that we need to ensure that climate resilience sanitation is part of the climate commitments, both in adaptation and mitigation. And this will allow us also to access climate finance that has been raised here before in some of the cases. No? I just wanted to basically finalize by saying that we are currently preparing a policy note for climate resilience sanitation, building on all of this work with many of you around the table. The note will be launched early next calendar year, and we will launch it in collaboration with partners from the Climate Resilient Sanitation Coalition. So thank you, Inigo, again, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Diego. And once again, thank you very much of everyone that has been presenting today, and also to almost the 100 people, maybe even more, if we mix them all that have been following this session. I think it's been great to share all these experiences and all the work that is being done in relation to climate resilient sanitation, and very looking forward to that paper, to that work that the World Bank is going to release next year. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Paula, and all the team that has been back on the scene. And see you soon, and see you around in World Water Week in case that you're in Stockholm. Bye.